It's slightly unusual, this one, I suppose. I read stuff all the time, as you can imagine. There's always magazine articles and newspaper stories and reports and all the rest of it circulating on social media and on the internet generally, and I read voluminous amounts of it. I know you all do as well. And a lot of it is very critical of stances that people like me have taken over the last couple of years. Conspiracy theorists being about the least of it. Have been accused of outright crankery for so long now that it's just become the norm. And I normally just, if I read it at all, I just let it go by. But every now and again, there seems to be a piece that I think that crystallises the problem. In the way that piece has been structured, that reveals something about that which we are up against. And so in the Critic magazine, today's the 28th of February, and the piece is dated the 28th of February. It's by a writer called Fred Sculthorpe, who I don't know from Adam. But there's a piece called Have We Really Lost the Plot? And in the piece, he refers to fellow commentators of his, like Josh Clancy, Sunday Times, and David Aronovich, who obviously has been, writing in all sorts of organs for forever. And he kicks off quite early on by saying that some people have completely lost their marbles, and that people like Glancy and Aronovich are right, he says, to have pointed out that people have lost their marbles. And, well, plainly, as the piece develops, I am also, it is to be assumed, one of those who has lost his marbles also. And to quote him again, a far bigger story that overshadows and complicates all of this, the endemic decline of trust, not just in the media, but in elite establishments, that persists across the West in the wake of the... and he goes on to say, I don't think Britain has lost the plot. Statistics show that globally Britain has some of the lowest belief in, quote, conspiracy theories. And then he says, one serious impression I did get was that a lot of these people, by which he means people like me with questions to ask, were lonely, lost and helpless, which suggests, open brackets, the poor, poor dears, close brackets. He says they normally had personal gripes with the impact of the lost businesses or a loved one who had committed suicide or gone insane being the most common. Open brackets, you might say, how awful for the poor souls, close brackets. It's that idea that he's acknowledging on the one hand that people were so significantly hurt, by loss of livelihoods, loss of businesses, feeling driven mad. Even people who have, in fact, had diagnosed mental health consequences as a result of it all, people committing suicide and the rest, that he acknowledges those people, but almost seems to brush them aside as collateral damage. He says, yes, all too often they were spouting nonsense. Spouting nonsense. I mean, he's already said that he acknowledged that they lost everything, these people, through no fault of their own, through diktats and other compulsory measures that were forced upon them, up to and consequences up to including loss of life through suicide, people being driven mad by it all, and yet they were all too often spouting nonsense. But the prevailing ideology was not one of a coherent political movement, but isolated paranoia and helplessness. And then we get to the nub of it. Rather than being seen as a dangerous threat to society, much of this should be viewed as one of the uglier symptoms of a government and pandemic response that was all too often incoherent, poorly communicated, and lacking in transparency. And in reply to that, I would say, precisely, those in government and within the media and the establishment, they had their chance from the beginning to be coherent, to communicate well, to be transparent. That is the point. They had that chance then. My point, and the point of, on behalf of other people that are name-checked in the piece, I would presume to say, is that they had that chance and instead they chose to shout down dissent, to ridicule dissent, to dismiss as conspiracy theorists and tin hat wearing loons. They saw people fired from their jobs. They watched people losing livelihoods, losing physical and mental health, losing everything. And they pushed propaganda and nothing but. They pushed a narrative of safe and effective, even in the face of mounting data that made a nonsense of the claim. And rather than be transparent, this is the point, the establishment, the media, the government, they obfuscated and lied rather than be anything like transparent. I quote him again, "It's hardly paranoid to criticise the influence of unaccountable transnational companies and organisations in response to the pandemic. Conspiracy favourite Bill Gates did indeed wield a large amount of control over the development of those aforementioned products that I can't mention on here through the Gates Foundation." Now, a few short months ago, that statement there that he feels able to make now about the undue influence of Gates and his foundation was roundly dismissed as conspiracy theory. People like me were invoking Gates months, years ago as having an influence in all of this. And to say as much then was conspiracy theory. The piece seems to imply that it was all along widely known and accepted how much influence Bill Gates had bought and paid for. But it was not accepted. Anyone invoking Bill Gates' name in this context was to be dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. And it was precisely because, and only because, the likes of me and others, I'm not going to name other people, but it was because of the likes of those of us who talked ad nauseum about Bill Gates and others wielding undue influence that we're now where we are. Which is to say, we now have to be patronised by reading it was always an accepted part of the debate, which it wasn't. If people like myself and scores of others hadn't been out there shouting from the rooftops into the wind, into the howling storm of all of this, that something was badly adrift, then all of it would still be being dismissed only as conspiracy theory. And the all too powerful, all-conquering orthodox narrative would be the only thing that was being said and heard and accepted. He quotes, "Sleazy NHS contracts, unnecessarily coercive methods of compliance, weak transparency amongst governments and pharmaceutical companies, the poor implementation and understanding of lockdown policy, the widening of income inequality, the serious physical and mental harm inflicted on society's most vulnerable," and so on. We know that now because some of us lost a great deal to stand up and say as much. We stood up in the howling wind of ridicule and accusations of conspiracy theory and all of the rest of it, and tin hat wearing, to make those points, to get those points out. That's implicit in a piece like this, that this was accepted. Sleazy NHS contracts, undue influence of Bill Gates. That is only out there now because we said it back when it was dangerously unfashionable to say so. If it hadn't been for us constantly harping on about all of that, it would still and only be being described as conspiracy theory. And that transformation from conspiracy theory into accepted part of the debate was not some sort of natural process that would have happened anyway. It depended upon people taking risks, real risks to their personal well-being and their ability to earn a living and retain their reputations at the same time. People had to risk all of that to talk about it all at that time when it was lethally unfashionable to do so. And what offends me is that it's the suggestion that in spite of the disinformation and the propaganda and the attempts to censor that were applied by mainstream media and by the government and by the big pharmaceutical companies, that we're still supposed to trust them, while the same message is still being relentlessly pushed. And so far, there has been no acknowledgement, none at all, of any harm done. We're still implicit in a piece like this is that the mainstream media and the government and the establishment and the big pharmaceutical companies are somehow to be trusted, when they're still doing what we were accusing them of doing all along. Transparency and accountability aren't flimsy report recommendations. They are the lifeblood of our democracy's social contract. Now, myself and others have been saying for months that the social contract is broken. That is the point, and it's those bodies and their actions that broke it.